The first thing my wife Clara ever planted in the yard of our house in Fairhaven, North Carolina, was not a rose or a hydrangea or anything grand enough to make a stranger stop and admire it. It was a crooked row of marigolds along the front walk, because, as she told me 41 years ago, every home deserved a little defiance. I laughed when she said it. She did not. Clara believed that flowers were an act of resistance against the hard edges of the world. She believed a garden should not look managed into obedience. She believed it should spill and wander and insist on being alive. In the 2 years since she died, that garden had become the only place in my life where I still felt the shape of her mind. It was where I heard her laugh when the wind moved through the foxgloves. It was where I remembered the way dirt always ended up on her cheek and never seemed to trouble her. It was where I carried my coffee every morning and talked to her as if the conversation had not ended, only changed form. Some people pray in churches. I prayed beside her roses. Our garden was not a thing of neat borders and respectable restraint. Clara had no use for respectable restraint. Along the white picket fence climbed old-fashioned roses in shades of crimson and cream. Lavender pressed into the stone path as if it had forgotten where it was supposed to stop. Daisies appeared in places no one had planted them. Black-eyed Susans leaned into coneflowers, which leaned into salvia, which leaned into whatever else had decided to take root. There were climbing clematis, wild grasses, bee balm, hollyhocks, delphinium, and cheerful little volunteers that Clara would never let me pull because, in her opinion, any flower brave enough to arrive uninvited had earned the right to stay. Children slowed on the sidewalk to look at it. Butterflies loved it. Bees adored it. I loved it because it still felt like a place where she had only just stepped inside for a moment and might come back carrying a trowel. The street around us, however, did not much care for places that looked alive. Our neighborhood in Fairhaven was called Briar Glen, which sounded romantic until you realized the people who named it had long since replaced every natural briar with regulations, codes, standards, and a homeowners association newsletter that treated ornamental gravel with the seriousness of statecraft. Most yards on our street were green, clipped, and tidy in the same way hotel lobbies are tidy. There was nothing wrong with them exactly. They simply looked as if no one had ever cried in them, or kissed in them, or buried a beloved dog beneath their trees, or planted something because it reminded them of their mother. Clara used to say most suburban lawns looked like they had been designed by men afraid of joy. I used to tell her to hush before a neighbor heard. She would grin and plant another peony. After Clara died, I kept the garden as best I could. I am not a young man. My knees complain. My back negotiates every bend. There were mornings when the grief sat on me like wet wool, and the idea of trimming roses or lifting mulch felt impossible. But the garden kept calling me out. It gave shape to my days. I watered. I weeded. I pruned where I understood how. I left alone what Clara would have wanted left alone. The result, if I am being honest, was not the immaculate and curated thing that a gardening magazine might praise. It was wilder now, fuller, sometimes untidy at the edges. Yet it had a soul, and in the loneliness that followed my wife's death, soul mattered more than appearance. Then the house next door sold. For almost a year it had been empty, its shutters closed, its porch gathering leaves, its silence settling into the rhythm of the street. Then one Monday a moving truck arrived, followed by a silver sports car so polished it seemed offended by dust. The new owner's name, I learned from the mailman before I learned it from the man himself, was Adrian Mercer. He was in his 30s, maybe 34 or 35, handsome in the brittle, expensive way that suggests a person has spent a great deal of time perfecting surfaces. Within 2 weeks, he had repainted the old house a stern shade of gray, replaced the porch lanterns with minimalist black fixtures, installed sharp white stone along the front beds, and removed every flowering shrub that had once softened the place. A crepe myrtle vanished. Azaleas vanished. Even the old bird bath was gone. By the end of the month, his yard looked like a rendering for a luxury townhouse development. Flat, controlled, airless. If a hospital had hired a landscape architect, it would have looked like that. Our first conversation took place over the low hedge between our properties. I was kneeling near Clara's patch of black-eyed Susans, trying to persuade a weed to surrender, when Adrian stepped outside in running shoes and a fitted quarter-zip, holding a stainless travel mug. "Morning," I called, because that is how I was raised, and because politeness costs less than bitterness. "Welcome to Briar Glen." He looked at me, then at my yard, then back at me. His gaze paused on the roses climbing the fence, the lavender spilling over the stones, the foxgloves tilting in the breeze, the impossible abundance of it all. "Thanks," he said. His voice was even, cool, almost professionally neutral. "Quite a lot happening over here." I smiled. "My wife liked a full garden." "I can see that," he said, in the same tone a man might use while evaluating storm damage. Then he turned and went back inside. If that had been all, he would have remained only another young professional with strange taste and too much money for black paint. But the first sign of trouble came 3 days later when a gust of wind scattered pale rose petals over the hedge and onto his lawn. I was at the kitchen window when I heard the roar of a leaf blower. Adrian stood in the yard in sunglasses and expensive headphones, directing every fallen petal back toward my side with the grave determination of someone clearing hazardous debris. The petals rose in little pink swirls and tumbled against my fence. I remember standing there with a dish towel in my hand, feeling something colder than anger settle into place. It was not the petals. It was the intention. He wanted me to see. The campaign that followed was made up of small indignities, each one plausible enough on its own to dismiss, but together they formed a steady pressure. He photographed my yard from the sidewalk more than once, pretending not to notice when I noticed. He made pointed comments to passing neighbors about standards and property values. I overheard him in his backyard on a phone call saying, "The place next door looks like a botanical accident." Another time, while trimming nothing more substantial than a strip of ornamental grass that looked fake even in sunlight, he laughed and said, "There's this old guy next door with a total jungle. I swear it's dragging the whole block down." I told myself not to care. I was 73 years old, a retired machinist, a widower, and tired in deep internal places that no sleep seemed to reach. I did not have the appetite to fight over aesthetics with a man young enough to still believe self-importance was a personality. Then the envelope arrived. It was cream-colored, official, and addressed in the kind of crisp typeface meant to make a person feel smaller before he has even opened it. In the upper left corner was the embossed seal of the Briar Glen Homeowners Association. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment staring at it before taking a letter opener from the drawer. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the clock above the stove that Clara used to threaten with replacement every daylight savings change. I unfolded the letter and read that my property had been found in violation of several community appearance standards: excessive unmanaged growth, landscaping extending beyond approved borders, planting density inconsistent with neighborhood uniformity. The language was bloodless in the way only bureaucratic language can be, so polished and distant that it can make cruelty sound procedural. At the bottom came the sentence that hollowed me out. I had 30 days to rectify the violations or be subject to escalating daily fines. Rectify. As if Clara's garden were an error. As if love, grief, memory, and the last thing that made my house feel inhabited by more than one soul could be corrected with hedge clippers and a contractor's invoice. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hand until the coffee in my mug went cold. There was a time when I would have fought that sort of thing without hesitation. I had once built a small machine shop from nothing more than war-era discipline and stubbornness. I had negotiated contracts, argued with inspectors, survived lean years, buried my parents, buried friends, and then, worst of all, buried my wife. The younger version of me would have marched into the next HOA meeting with photographs, receipts, testimony, and enough fury to carry the night. But grief is a thief with unusual taste. It does not only take joy, it takes appetite, it takes momentum. It hollows out the instinct that tells a man he is still equal to conflict. I looked at that letter and felt only exhaustion. Adrian had energy. The HOA had rules. I had a bad knee, a silent house, and a garden that suddenly felt like a doomed country I had no army to defend. For the next week, I tried to imagine fighting. Each version ended with me sitting in a folding chair beneath fluorescent lights while people discussed my wife's roses as if they were a drainage problem. I could not bear it. So I did what sorrow had taught me to do too often. I chose surrender before the battle had properly begun. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself Clara would not have wanted me dragged through petty conflict. I told myself flowers could be replanted, bushes reshaped, a memory carried elsewhere. All of this was unconvincing even as I thought it. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was tired, and I was alone, and I did not think anyone would stand beside me if I resisted. So I decided I would tear the garden back until it looked sufficiently dead to satisfy them. The days before the deadline acquired a strange brightness. Everything in the garden seemed heightened by the fact that I was counting down to its destruction. The roses bloomed with a sort of insolence. Bees moved through the lavender as if no one had informed them of the legal situation. Clara's old wind chime, the one shaped like dragonflies, kept sounding in the evenings from the porch. I found myself talking to her more often. "I'm sorry," I said out loud one morning while deadheading daisies. "I know." Another day I stood beside the foxgloves and said, "I tried to keep it the way you liked." The words felt foolish and necessary at the same time. Grief is like that. It makes a private religion out of ordinary objects. The Saturday before the deadline was warm for October. The light came in soft and gold, and the garden looked so beautiful it was almost cruel. The crimson climbing roses on the fence were in one last full flush. Lavender still held its scent. Clara's stubborn patch of cosmos had reseeded itself into a loose pink cloud near the path. I carried the pruning shears and the long-handled loppers from the garage and set them beside the shed. Then I sat down on the old stone bench in the middle of the garden, the one Clara and I bought on our 40th anniversary, because she said every true garden needed a place to sit and admire your own persistence. I remember looking at the tools and thinking, tomorrow I will begin betraying you. That was when I noticed the woman and the little girl on the sidewalk. I had seen them before during evening walks. The woman was in her 30s, maybe a little older, with chestnut hair usually pulled back and the watchful, tired face of someone raising a child largely on her own. The girl was perhaps 7, solemn one minute and bright the next, the sort of child who stopped for every interesting leaf. Many times I had caught her slowing in front of Clara's garden, eyes wide at the flowers. That morning they stopped again. The little girl pressed both hands to the pickets and whispered something I could not hear. The woman looked at the garden, then at me, and whatever she saw in my face made her expression change. It softened first, then tightened, as if compassion had turned almost immediately into anger. She gave me a small nod, not exactly a greeting, more an acknowledgement between people who understand that something has gone terribly wrong. Then she led the child on down the sidewalk. I thought no more of it, because when you have already decided to lose, you stop looking for rescue. The woman's name, though I did not know it then, was Hannah Reeves. The little girl was her daughter, Poppy. Hannah lived 3 streets over in a rented duplex and worked remotely for an insurance firm, while also managing the impossible mechanics of single motherhood with the grim competence of someone who knows there is no alternative. She had watched my garden on those walks for months. Poppy called it the storybook yard. Hannah had once taken a photograph of it in June because the roses and salvia had looked like they belonged on a puzzle box. What she saw on my face that Saturday morning was not mere sadness. It was resignation, the most dangerous kind, because it is so quiet no one hears it unless they have known it themselves. That night, after she had fed Poppy, supervised homework, negotiated a bath, and finally tucked the child into bed with a chapter of Charlotte's Web, Hannah opened the private Briar Glen community page on her laptop. She stared at the blinking cursor for nearly a minute, then began to type. She introduced herself. She wrote that her daughter and she walked past my house often, and that my garden was one of the few places in the neighborhood that felt genuinely alive. She wrote that she had learned a widower was being forced by the HOA to tear down the memorial garden he had built with his late wife after a complaint from a neighbor. She attached the photograph of Clara's garden she had taken in June, sunlit and overflowing, bees visible over the lavender if you looked closely. Then she wrote what became the sentence that changed everything. This Saturday at 9 in the morning, I'll be at Mr. Holloway's house with gloves, mulch, coffee, and anything else I can carry. I hope I won't be there alone. The first responses came from people Hannah half knew and half expected. A retired librarian named Marcia, who believed every act of neighborliness was a form of local government. A broad-shouldered fire captain named Leon, who had once rebuilt a stranger's porch after a storm and thought nothing of it. A middle school art teacher named Denise, who said her students sketched my garden every spring because it was the only yard in the area with enough color to teach from. An older man named Calvin, who wrote, "The HOA can find me too if they like. I'm bringing hedge trimmers." Then the comments multiplied. People confessed they had always loved the yard. A couple wrote that their toddler called it the butterfly house. Someone else said her grandmother had cut through my alley years ago just to smell the roses. Another admitted he had assumed the garden looked wild by design and was horrified to learn it was under threat. By 10 o'clock, Hannah's post had more activity than anything the community page had ever seen, including the summer debate over mailbox paint. Still, she knew social media was not a neighborhood. It was only one of its shadows. The next day, she printed copies of the photograph, wrote the time and address on the back, and went door to door. Briar Glen had the usual suburban habits of polite distance. People waved from driveways and knew each other's dogs before they knew each other's last names. But stories travel quickly when they carry grief and injustice in equal measure. Hannah told people about the widower, about the late wife, about the letter, about the complaint from the new neighbor in the gray house. She did not exaggerate because she did not need to. The truth was already offensive enough. By evening, she had, without meaning to, assembled something larger than sympathy. She had assembled a purpose. I knew none of this. On Saturday morning, I woke before dawn with a pressure in my chest that felt like a hand. This was the day I had chosen to begin dismantling the last living piece of Clara. I made coffee, though I could barely drink it. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden through the window above the sink. The light was just beginning to gather. Roses were dark shapes against the fence. The dragonfly chimes stirred once in the breeze. I thought of Clara in old gardening gloves and a faded blue bandana, kneeling in the dirt and telling me that soil forgave almost anything if you kept showing up. "I'm sorry," I said again to the empty kitchen. Then I stood, carried my mug to the porch, and went to the shed for the shears. I had just raised them to the old climbing rose by the fence, Clara's favorite, when I heard the sound of multiple car doors closing. At first I thought the HOA had sent someone absurdly official to monitor compliance. Then I heard voices, not stern voices, friendly ones. Laughter, the rumble of a wheelbarrow, the clink of metal tools. I lowered the shears and turned toward the street. They were coming up the sidewalk in groups. There were dozens of them, neighbors from all over Briar Glen, most carrying something in their hands, bags of mulch, pruners, rakes, shovels, coffee carriers, a folding table, boxes of donuts. Someone had brought a cooler. Children trotted beside adults with gardening gloves dangling from their wrists. At the front walked Hannah Reeves and little Poppy, who was balancing a tray of muffins with the solemn responsibility of a child entrusted with something important. For a second, I genuinely thought my mind had slipped. Grief does odd things. Solitude does more. I stood there in the middle of Clara's garden with the shears hanging uselessly from my hand and watched an army of neighbors march up my drive. Hannah reached me first. She was slightly out of breath, but smiling in a way that carried both warmth and defiance. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," she said. "Looks like you could use some help." I opened my mouth and failed to produce a single coherent word. Behind her, Leon the fire captain set down 2 bags of mulch and called, "Where do you want us?" Marcia the librarian held up a clipboard she had apparently brought for no reason other than being the sort of woman who believed all collective action benefited from a clipboard. Denise the art teacher was already kneeling near the front bed, squinting thoughtfully at the overgrown edges like a woman studying a painting she intended to restore. Poppy stepped forward with a muffin and said, "My mom says we're saving the flowers." That was the first moment I felt my throat close. "I don't understand," I managed. Hannah glanced around at the people filling the yard. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "And you shouldn't have had to." Then, a little louder so the others could hear, she added, "The goal is simple. We keep the garden. We make it neat enough to satisfy the rules without destroying what matters. Nobody pulls anything unless Mr. Holloway says so. Nobody changes the soul of the place. Agreed?" A murmur of agreement ran through the group. Someone clapped. I had not cried in front of strangers since Clara's funeral, but I had to turn away for a second because there was too much happening inside my chest all at once. Relief, disbelief, gratitude, grief breaking open in a new direction. Then they got to work. It was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. Not because it was dramatic, though in its own quiet way it was. It was beautiful because of the care. No one stormed the garden as if it were a project. They entered it like a memory they had been invited to protect. People asked questions. Which rose was Clara's favorite? Could this patch be thinned without losing the daisies? Did I want the lavender cut back hard or just shaped? Leon edged the front path with the precision of a man who had once found meaning in straight lines. Denise showed a group of children how to tell the difference between a weed and a volunteer wildflower. Marcia stationed herself near the gate and somehow became both registrar and historian, telling late arrivals, "That bench was the hallway's 40th anniversary gift to themselves. Mind the corner there." A teenager named Ben, who I knew only as the boy who skateboarded too fast near the mailbox cluster, spent half an hour carefully tying back clematis as if he had been born to gentleness. By mid-morning, the yard had become less a work site than a celebration. Coffee moved from hand to hand. Someone turned on soft music from a portable speaker. Poppy and 2 other children solemnly watered newly tidied borders with little cans while being supervised by a woman from Juniper Lane who introduced herself as Nina and seemed to know every child in Briar Glen by name and shoe size. I wandered through it all in a daze. Every few steps, another neighbor told me a story I had never heard. A man said his wife used to walk past our place after chemotherapy because the smell of the roses made one day each week feel almost bearable. A college student home for the weekend told me she had taken prom photos in front of our fence because no backdrop in the neighborhood was prettier. An older couple said they had always slowed their evening walks at Clara's garden because it reminded them of England. These things had been happening around me all those years, and I had not known. I thought the garden had been a private conversation between Clara and me. It turned out it had been speaking to the whole neighborhood. And across the hedge, on his smooth and silent patch of perfect green, stood Adrian Mercer. He came out in athletic clothes, probably intending a run, and stopped dead when he saw half the neighborhood gathered in my yard. He looked first irritated, then incredulous, then offended in a way that only made his isolation more visible. His complaint had not produced compliance. It had produced fellowship. The exact thing men like him never anticipate is that their attempts to control others might reveal how little anyone wishes to stand near them. For the first hour, he stayed on his porch with his arms crossed. Then he moved to the edge of his lawn. He kept glancing at his phone, perhaps considering another report, another rule to invoke, some authority he could summon to restore the world to the shape he preferred. But authority looks different when 30 neighbors are laughing in a flower bed, while children carry watering cans, and a widower who has looked half dead for weeks is speaking more in one morning than he has in months. Around noon, after the roses had been shaped, the front border redefined, the path cleared, and the outer beds mulched to a respectable level of HOA approved order, the work slowed. People stood around wiping sweat from their foreheads and admiring what had been accomplished. Clara's garden still looked like Clara's garden. That was the miracle. It remained exuberant, alive and full, yet the edges were cleaner. The path was visible. The beds had form. The whole place looked not diminished, but cared for by many hands. It was at precisely that moment that Adrian disappeared back into his house. When he re-emerged 10 minutes later, he was carrying a large tray with a pitcher of lemonade and a stack of plastic cups. The yard went quiet almost instantly. He stopped at the hedge, awkward in a way I would not have thought possible for him. The armor of composure he usually wore seemed to fit him poorly all at once. He cleared his throat. "It looked like," he said, staring somewhere near my shoulder rather than at my face, "you all might need something cold." No one answered immediately. Not because people wanted to punish him, I think, but because everyone understood without speaking that something important was happening, and important things sometimes require a little silence to arrive fully. I walked to the hedge, took a cup from the stack, and said, "Thank you, son." That was thoughtful. He finally looked at me then. In his eyes, I did not see remorse exactly, not yet. I saw disorientation, the beginning of shame, the first crack in a life organized around surfaces. He nodded once, almost stiffly. "I didn't realize," he said, then stopped. "I can see that," I replied, and for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I smiled at him. Not to absolve him, only to make room. He set the tray down on the hedge and stepped back. Neighbors began taking cups. Conversation resumed, softer at first, then warmer. The children, uninterested in adult drama, declared the lemonade pretty good. That made Leon laugh, which made others laugh too, and just like that, the moment was carried forward into ordinary human noise. Adrian returned to his porch but did not go inside. By late afternoon, the work was done. Clara's garden glowed. The roses had been deadheaded and tied in where needed. The lavender was trimmed just enough to restore shape. The front path had fresh mulch at its borders, and stones swept clean. The larger volunteer growth at the sidewalk had been reduced, but not eliminated. The foxgloves still stood. The cosmos still wandered. The whole place looked as if someone had taken great care not to erase joy while still making it legible to rule followers. People lingered after the work finished. They ate muffins and the last donuts. They sat on the grass and the bench and the porch steps. More introductions were made in that one afternoon than had probably occurred in the previous 3 years combined. At some point, Hannah sat beside me on Clara's stone bench, accepted a paper cup of lemonade from her daughter, and said, "You know this isn't just about flowers." "I'm beginning to understand that," I said. She nodded toward the yard full of neighbors. "Good, because they're not done with you." She was right. The complaint disappeared the following week. No grand apology came from the HOA. There was no admission of pettiness, no reckoning over the fact that the phrase community standards had nearly been used to destroy the most communal thing on the street. The fines simply never materialized. An email circulated thanking residents for their efforts in maintaining neighborhood beauty, which was both absurd and, in its way, confirmation that the association had no stomach for a public fight after seeing how widely the sentiment had shifted. Clara's garden was, for the moment, safe, but the greater change was not legal. It was personal. My house had been quiet for 2 years in a way that bordered on unnatural. Grief does not only silence the dead, it can silence the living around them. After the garden rescue, that quiet began to break. Hannah and Poppy stopped by on walks. Poppy wanted updates on which flowers were winning and which bees were the regulars. Leon came by one evening with spare edging stone he said he just happened to have, which was a transparent lie but a kind one. Marcia brought banana bread and stayed to talk about books Clara had loved. Denise asked if her art club could sketch the garden in spring. Neighbors began waving more slowly, then stopping, then stepping through the gate. They asked for cuttings from Clara's roses. They asked the names of plants. They asked about Clara herself. I found myself telling stories I had thought I would carry alone forever. How she once planted tulips upside down and still blamed the squirrels. How she sang to tomato seedlings. How she once told a bishop at a church fundraiser that God had intended lawns to be meadows until accountants intervened. A week after the rescue, I was in the side yard watering the old climbing rose when Adrian appeared at the hedge. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking deeply uncomfortable. "That one," he said, pointing at the rose. "The red climbing one. It's beautiful." He said the word as if it were new equipment he was still learning to use. "Clara's favorite," I replied. He nodded. "I owe you an apology." I set the hose down. "Yes," I said. To his credit, he didn't flinch. "I moved here because I thought starting over meant controlling every variable," he said after a moment. "New city, new house, new routine. I wanted everything clean, simple, manageable. Your yard felt like the opposite of that, and instead of asking why it mattered, I treated it like a problem." He drew a breath. "I'm sorry." The interesting thing about old age is that revenge loses some of its flavor. I had imagined, in smaller, bitter moments, what satisfaction I might take in humiliating him. Yet standing there, looking at this younger man stripped of arrogance and speaking plainly for perhaps the first time since he'd moved in, what I felt most strongly was sadness. Not for myself, for the poverty of a life built entirely around control. "Thank you," I said. "That's enough for today." From there, something slow and improbable began. Adrian did not become likable overnight. Change rarely looks dramatic when it is real. It looks awkward, repetitive, slightly embarrassing. He started by asking practical questions through the hedge. Which roses did well in this climate? Why did lavender like poor soil? Were native wildflowers hard to maintain? The first time he asked if I thought a small flower bed might work near his porch, he did so in the tone of a man confessing to a vice. I told him yes. The first time he came over with gloves on and helped me spread compost, he handled the rake like a junior executive being forced into a trust exercise. By the end of the hour, he had dirt on his forearm and did not seem to know what to make of that. Poppy, who regarded social complexity as a waste of time, accepted him immediately after he admitted he did not know the difference between a bee balm and a coneflower. "That's okay," she told him. "You can still learn." There is no humiliation quite so cleansing as being kindly instructed by a child. Winter came and the garden went to sleep, though not entirely. Clara had always insisted a good winter garden should still hold shape, so the hydrangea skeletons remained, the ornamental grasses stayed up, and seed heads fed birds at dawn. During those months, the neighborhood continued its strange flowering. People gathered for soup nights and impromptu porch drinks. Hannah discovered that several parents on Cedar Court needed after-school help and quietly organized a rotation. Leon and Calvin repaired a widow's broken gate without being asked. Marcia began a little free library near the mailboxes. Briar Glen had always had houses. Now it was making a community. I do not say Clara's garden caused all of that alone. Human beings contain more readiness for decency than they often show. But I do think the garden rescue reminded people that a neighborhood can be more than parallel private lives separated by property lines. In spring, Adrian planted his first patch of wildflowers. At first it was modest, a narrow bed along the side fence with black-eyed Susans, purple cone flowers, coreopsis, and a few salvias Hannah insisted were for beginners who need encouragement. He kept apologizing for the bed not being straight enough, full enough, designed enough. I told him flowers are not improved by shame. Clara would have told him more bluntly. By June, the bed was thriving. Bees found it. Butterflies found it. Adrian stood in front of it one evening with his hands on his hips and the baffled smile of a man who had accidentally made something honest. "It's a little messy," he said. "Yes," I told him. "That's the idea." The first annual Briar Glen Garden Party happened almost by accident the following September. Hannah suggested a small potluck in my yard to mark 1 year since the rescue. Marcia turned that into a sign-up sheet. Leon borrowed folding tables from the station. Denise convinced the teenagers to hang lights through the fence and porch trees. Someone printed flyers with a watercolor sketch of Clara's roses done by one of her students. Adrian, in a development that would have made old versions of him faint, volunteered to handle drinks and then spent 3 hours choosing pictures that were not, in his words, embarrassingly flimsy. By late afternoon, my backyard was full. There were children running through the sprinkler in clothes their parents had long given up on protecting. There were bowls of pasta salad and trays of barbecue and peach cobbler and cornbread, and 3 different versions of lemonade, one of which Poppy had declared too lemony and therefore a scientific success. There was music from a portable speaker, then from Calvin's son playing acoustic guitar near the porch. Denise's students displayed sketches of the garden on a folding board by the gate. Marcia held court near the hydrangeas discussing mystery novels. Leon manned the grill like a benevolent general. Hannah moved through the yard checking on everyone while pretending not to, and beside the old stone bench stood Adrian Mercer, holding a serving spoon and arguing with a retired nurse about whether dahlias counted as fussy. At sunset, the light strung through the fence came on. The garden, Clara's garden, glowed. The roses along the back fence still bloomed. Lavender leaned fragrant into the path. Children darted between adults. Poppy, now self-appointed assistant hostess, wore a flower crown so crooked it nearly slipped over one eye. I stood by the grill with a paper plate in one hand and looked out at the yard full of people who no longer felt like strangers. My chest ached, but not in the old way. Grief was still there. It always would be. Loss does not vanish because joy returns. They simply learn to occupy the same body. Adrian came to stand beside me and followed my gaze across the yard. Along his own fence, visible through the hedge, his once sterile lawn now had a widening border of coneflowers, wild asters, and late-blooming zinnias. "I used to think order was the same thing as peace," he said quietly. "A lot of people do," I replied. He nodded. "I was wrong." "Yes," I said, and smiled so he would hear the kindness in it before the tease. "You were." He laughed at that, a real laugh, and then his expression changed. "This," he said, gesturing with the serving spoon at the children, the lights, the flowers, the crowd. "This is what I thought neighborhoods were supposed to be when I was a kid. I just forgot somewhere." I looked at the yard, at Hannah talking with Marcia, at Leon handing a hot dog to a little boy, at Poppy crouched near the lavender explaining bee etiquette to 2 younger children, at Denise's drawings fluttering gently in the warm evening air. Then I looked at Clara's roses. "I think she remembered for all of us," I said. Later that night, After the last dishes were stacked and the last chairs folded and people had carried home leftovers in mismatched containers, I stood alone in the garden for a while. Not lonely, alone, which is different. The light still glowed softly along the fence. A few paper lanterns shifted in the warm breeze. Somewhere inside the house, the refrigerator hummed, steady and ordinary. I touched the back of the stone bench and looked at the place where Clara once knelt to plant tulips, at the roses she had loved, at the little path where Poppy's shoes had worn 2 fresh scuffs in the mulch. I thought about the letter that had almost erased all this. I thought about Adrian on his porch a year ago, sealed inside his own certainty. I thought about Hannah seeing an old man's face and deciding that surrender would not be allowed to stand uncontested. Most of all, I thought about Clara, who had always believed that beauty was not decorative. It was connective. It invited people toward each other. It made room for tenderness in places designed for efficiency. For a long time after she died, I believed I was tending the garden to keep her memory alive. Standing there in the warm dark after the party, listening to the faint echo of laughter still caught in the fence and flowers, I finally understood the truth. The garden had been keeping me alive. It had held me until other people arrived. It had stayed unruly enough, stubborn enough, fragrant enough, visible enough to call a neighborhood out of its sleep. It had exposed one man's emptiness and then offered him a way back. It had turned my widow's grief into a meeting place. And because Clara had planted with faith in what beauty could do, because she had refused tidy little borders for love or color or life, the thing they tried to classify as an eyesore had become, in the end, the heart of Briar Glen. That is what I tell people now when they stop at the gate and ask about the garden. I tell them my wife built it with dirty hands and extravagant opinions. I tell them flowers are sometimes stronger than rules. I tell them a real community is not measured by how uniform it appears from the street, but by how quickly it gathers when one of its own is about to lose the last thing that makes home feel like home. Then, if they have time, I point to the first crooked row of marigolds by the front walk. I planted those again this spring, for defiance.